Yesterday's Marvel Snap Patch didn't bring with it any card changes, but it did bring with it a ton of new card data mines. Let's dig on into the details of 12 delicious designs that are going to be coming to the game over the course of December and January in their current data mine form. Let's kick things off with our December season pass card, Galactica, daughter of Galactus, a 4/6 whose text box says each turn the first card you play at another location reveals with +3 power. This seems like an incredibly powerful effect. At surface level, you play Galactica on turn 4, and then the first card you play on turn 5 and 6 each get +3. So base minimum, this card looks like she's a 4/12 with a flexible amount of stats across the board, i.e. they're not all going to get blown away by a singular tech card, which is nice. And that's even before you get into the various deck building considerations that let you get even more stats out of her. You can give her bonus to a Black Panther and double it up. You could have Brood be the first card you play, and the way this is templated reads like it'll copy to the Broodlings as well. I think it's going to be very reasonable to get 15 or even 20 plus points of power out of Galactica with a number of synergies, and that's even before you consider you could be dropping her as early as turn 3 on the back of something like Zabu or Psylocke. Overall, I really like Galactica's design. I think she's a stellar choice for the season pass. She's both a card that you can build around with express synergies, but she's also a pretty generically good stuff card that you could slot in most places and be happy with the result. Our first weekly card release on December the 3rd, releasing alongside the season pass, is Luna Snow, a 3/5 whose on reveal effect adds an ice cube to both sides of her location. The ice cube, really unique effect here, 1 energy, 0 power. At the start of each turn, get +1 energy. Then if your side is full here, destroy this. Energy acceleration, obviously very powerful in games like Marvel Snap, but I think even this symmetrical energy acceleration that Luna Snow provides is likely very beneficial. Her stat line is competitive, and your deck can be built around knowing that you're often going to have extra energy going into turn 4 to leverage her effect better than the opponent. This also has a minor clutter effect, which can have utility in some spots. You could also make Luna Snow's effect explicitly not be both sides, because you could play her into a location where your opponent already has 3 cards, meaning they're going to get 1 turn with the ice cube and extra energy before it pops, while yours will remain for the remainder of the game. I'd be pretty surprised if this card isn't competitive somewhere, both because of her stat line and her effect being unique and powerful. Our next December card release, set to drop on the 12th, is Peni Parker. Her on reveal adds SP//DR to your hand, and she also reads, when this merges, you get +1 energy next turn. The card that she creates is essentially a 3 energy Hulkbuster with a little bit of upside. It's a 3/3 that says merge with one of your cards here. You can move that card next turn. So obviously she has direct synergy with the card that she's creating. You can play Penny on turn 2, and then you merge this card into her on turn 3. That gives you an extra energy on turn 4, while also giving you flexibility to move this 6-statted thing around the board. It's also worth noting that Penny's ability doesn't explicitly require merging with her own suit, so cards like Agony and Hulkbuster in tandem with Penny could be additional sources to make her a more consistent means of ramping. In fact, if you're playing Agony on 1 and then Penny on 2, she could serve as a secondary Psylocke in a pinch, giving you 4 energy on the 3rd turn of the game. This design feels tough to evaluate because there's a lot of moving parts in the literal and metaphorical sense here, but I'd be kind of surprised if it's not playable, looking to be an absolute banger month of card releases so far. Next up, we have Doom 2099, set to release on December 17th. At the end of each turn, add a Doombot 2099 to a random location if you played exactly 1 card. The Doombot 2099 is a 4/2 that has the ongoing effect, your other Doombots and Doom have +1 power. So at a glance, 2099 Doom here triggers himself on turn 4, assuming you played him as your only card. Then if you play out one card on 5 and one card on 6, you get 2 Doombot 2099s over the course of most games without working too terribly hard. 3 Doombot 2099s mean that your base Doom 2099 and all 3 of the clones end up at 5 points of power, or loosely 20 points of power for 4 energy spread out across the board, which is a pretty good rate. One question mark in my mind that I don't think we'll get a clear answer to until these cards are officially announced is, how does the existing Doctor Doom that we already have interface with these? The verbiage that we have in the data mine says that your other Doombots in Doom have +1 power, so that could apply to our existing 6 energy Doctor Doom, meaning that if you played that Doom on turn 6, it would give you a total of 5 Doombots, which would give all of your Doombots +5 on average, meaning that your Doctor Doom that you played on the last turn would be 10 stats everywhere, and your Doom 2099 and his bots would be 7 everywhere, which would be a total of 58 power across just these 2 cards, which is an impressive number of stats, which leads me to believe that's probably not how it's going to work, but we can dream. I will say that even if this doesn't have direct synergy with our existing Doctor Doom, getting 20 points of power out of our 4-drop seems very reasonable, and if we work a little bit, i.e. discounting this card to play it early with something like Zabu or Psylocke, you could get an additional Doombot out of it over the course of the game, which turns into not only another body, but also more power across the rest of our bodies, which would be pretty impressive. Our next December card release, set to drop on Christmas Eve 12/24, is Bruce Banner, a 2/1 who says, when you end a turn with unspent energy, have a 25% chance to Hulk out. Well, I'm going to make a pretty big assumption here. I would wager it's a correct one. I assume that Hulk out means that this card simply transforms into our 6/12 copy of the regular Hulk, and if that's the case, this is likely a pretty powerful card. I think the best way to think about this is, if you're dropping it on turn 2 and you have an unspent energy on 3, 4, 5, and 6, statistically you're going to end up with a 12 power Hulk for just 2 energy over the course of most games. Obviously, that's going to require that you have unspent energy on a lot of those turns, but this, when slotted in with other things that want you to be passing with unspent energy, such as Sunspot or She-Hulk, or things like High Evolutionary, Regular Hulk, or Cyclops, I think that's going to be a pretty reasonable thing to meet. You could also use magic to generate Limbo to give yourself an extra turn to have an even higher probability that this 2-drop hulks out for you. I'm honestly excited for this card to get added to the game. High Evolutionary is an archetype that's felt this close to being competitive again a few times I've played it, and getting a new tool like this that you get to play efficiently early on curve, I think is something that it very much wants to get to that next level potentially. Our last December card is Rocket Raccoon and Groot, set to drop on New Year's Eve 12/31. This is a 3/3 that says you can move this once. After your opponent plays a card here, steal 1 power from it. I absolutely love this design. Cards that can move once over the course of the game, like Nightcrawler, Jeff, and Nocturne, have a lot of good flexible utility to get you into hard-to-reach locations. They tend to be fairly playable overall, and the effect here is a neat one to have in tandem with your ability to move around the board, especially considering that move cards always happen first now, meaning even if you don't have priority, you could slide this into another spot and grab stats off of your opponent's card there. It'll create a little bit of a shell game that, while it creates a positive swing for you, doesn't win or lose the game on the spot. And I think there'll be interesting moments to level your opponent with it, but obviously there will be others as well where we're just flipping a coin. I think overall, I expect this to maybe be one of the weaker cards this month, just because in terms of raw stats, it's not adding a ton to the board, but its ability to move around in terms of utility could easily mean that it ends up being one of the more played long term, since that flexibility has a lot of value in my opinion. Moving on to the January season, releasing on my birthday, January 7th, we have the Iron Patriot as our potential season pass card. This is a 2/3 with the on reveal effect. Add a random 4, 5, or 6 cost card to your hand. If you're winning here after the next turn, give it -4 cost. I like the dynamic on this card a lot. Things like Agent Coulson tend to be very powerful because they add a random element, but it's also controlled in where you play it out. And I like the fact that this is a card that really rewards you for having presence on the board early. I think there's oftentimes a lot of decks in Marvel Snap that don't care about putting stats out till late. And I think the templating on Iron Patriot here, making it so you contest a board space early to get an extra bonus, is an interesting deck building requirement. This is probably the card where I finally have to admit to people, you probably need to buy Hydra Bob. He's not replaceable, just because Bob on turn 1 into Iron Patriot on turn 2 will be a really clean way to have a lot of stats. That being said, there's also the dynamic of snapping to move Bob, so it's going to create some interesting play patterns overall, I would wager. It's also kind of neat that Iron Patriot has some synergy with Rocket and Groot, our card from the last week of the December season, because if you have priority, you could Iron Patriot a lane and then Rocket and Groot there, and then anything your opponent played there to contest gets shrunk down. Also has good synergy with other cheaper Guardians in general. Maybe this is the card that finally puts Star-Lord on the map, Copium? I think overall, I both like this design and think, again, it makes a pretty solid selection for a season pass card. It has the potential to just be a solid, generic, good stuff card, but there's also deck building synergy with things like playing to the board early and cards like Collector that can work in tandem with this. Our first weekly January card release, set to drop on the 7th as well, is Victoria Hand, a 2/3 with the ongoing effect, your cards created in your hand have +2 power. This is an interesting design because notable that her being an ongoing effect as opposed to a triggered ability has a couple impacts. The first is that she doesn't need to be in play when your cards get created, meaning you could deploy her at the end of the game and then suddenly all of your created cards on the board from various sources get bigger. She has really nice clean synergies with existing cards like Agent Coulson, where you could play her on turn 2, play Coulson on 3, and then play out your 4 and 5 over the course of the game. Her effect being ongoing means you could duplicate it with something like Mystique, which I wouldn't think is great, but it also means that you get protection from things like Shadow King wiping it away. Snowguard, I think, is a card that's worth calling out in this instance. That's been close to being playable in a number of spots before, and in tandem with Victoria, her bird being a 3/5 and the bear being a 3/6 could potentially push them over the top. She also has clean synergy with something like Kate Bishop, where so long as you're dodging the acid arrow, you're going to end up getting +4 stats for a card that's already pretty playable. While there's definitely some value and deck building puzzles to be solved with Victoria, she's an interesting card. I also wouldn't be surprised if she's ultimately one of the weaker cards that we're going to cover in today's roundup. Our second weekly release in January, set to drop on the 14th, is Bullseye, a 4/5 with the activate effect. Discard all cards that cost 1 or less from your hand. Afflict that many different enemy cards with -2 power. This is a card that tickles my brain in a few different ways. I really love this design. At base level, this could have synergy in a regular discard deck. You both get to bin copies of Agony and your copies of Swarm that are already free to not only double the amount of swarms that you have in your hand, but also get value across your opponent's board for afflicting them. Obviously, this is an afflict card, so it could potentially have synergy in something with High Evolutionary or Ajax. But the fact that this is activate also gives you a lot of control over the timing window on it, and I could see a world where maybe we play this alongside something like Falcon, where on the last turn of the game we pick up a bunch of crappy Icemen and Spider-Hams and stuff, and then Bullseye ditches them all to shrink your opponent's side of the board, potentially even juking something like a Killmonger, since we're picking up our ones and turning them into value in a very different way. I don't know how strong this card's going to be necessarily, but I think the design is definitely interesting, and there's a few different knobs they can turn if it ends up shooting a little bit low in terms of power level. Our next January card set to release on the 21st is Moonstone, a 4/5 who has the ongoing effect, has the ongoing effects of your other 1, 2, and 3 cost cards here. The first thing that jumps to my mind when I read this is the fact that Mystique is a 3 cost ongoing card that can have a powerful effect from a more expensive ongoing card. So, for example, you could play something like Claw on turn 5, and then you could Mystique it into Moonstone's path on turn 6 to get double Claws in the lane to the right. There could potentially have something to do with Iron Man doing something similar, perhaps with Onslaught or Living Tribunal as well. This one seems a little bit quirky. I'd love to hear in the comments down below what combos jump to your mind when you look at Moonstone. Our final January card set to release on the 28th is Ares, a 4/6 who says on reveal, compare the power of the top 3 cards of both decks. If your total is higher, get +6 stats. A 4/12 is definitely competitive in terms of rate, but it's kind of specific as to what has to happen to have that break in your favor. At a glance, this seems like it'll be good inside of Scar decks. It'll enable things like Suitor, and those decks have high base power, meaning that its trigger is more likely to happen. The downside is this is a card that they'll be able to disrupt your big stat line with something like Shadow King, so it's not without risk, but you're also getting a stat line that's a bit bigger than other things like Atuma or Typhoid Mary as a trade-off. Our final data mine to cover today actually doesn't have a release date currently associated with it, so extra asterisk on this one. When this happened in the past, the cards often got complete redesigns, but I still wanted to call out Toxie Doxie since she was here. A 2/4 with a very powerful on reveal, draw a card, you can't play cards next turn. Being able to draw even one additional card in a game like Marvel Snap makes combos way more consistent when we're already seeing 75% of our deck in a given game, although it's worth noting her drawback is pretty large here. Thinking about a game where Toxie Doxie is your first card that you play on 2, she does cleanly give you an extra card. You have 4 cards in hand when you play her out on 2. She draws you up to 5. You draw a 6 on turn 3 and play nothing. You draw a 7th card on turn 4, and now you're ahead. It is worth noting that if you don't play a 1 energy card out in front of her, though, one of the many locations that adds even 1 additional card to your hand will end up breaking that extra draw, kind of undoing her effect. So I think I would expect if she released like this, you would most often want to include her inside of decks where you are playing something out beforehand. I could definitely see this design being something that Living Tribunal decks, for example, want to play. They're very interested in getting a card deeper, and they probably don't mind giving up their 3rd turn all that often. While January obviously has some bangers in it, I think the December Marvel Rival season seems absolutely pushed, which honestly I think is something Marvel Snap kind of needs right now. The last few months of card releases have had a lot of mediocre and underpowered misses, and while that's great for letting players save their spotlight keys, it's not really exciting in terms of generating new gameplay that's interesting and fun. I'm hoping that some of these designs can break up that kind of stagnant feeling that I personally have been experiencing around Marvel Snap lately. I can feel the wheels in my brain start to turn with some deck building puzzles that I'm excited to dive into as these cards release. I would love to hear in the comments down below which of these upcoming cards you're most excited to get your hands on. And as always, if you enjoyed my breakdown, make sure you smash the like button on this video to hopefully help it reach some more people on this accursed platforms and its miserable algorithms.